Warning: this is a true crime channel and is not for the faint of heart or the easily impressionable. This video may contain details that some viewers may find highly disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You have been warned. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, where I still don't have any of the proper equipment. I refuse to follow the script, and where my jokes are so cringe-inducing that they may actually lead to semi-permanent disfigurement of the face. Today my lovely horde is extra special to me, as I will be touching base on one of my favorite kind of serial killers. Yes, my dearest ones, we will be discussing yet another cannibal. And this one is also in my top 5 favorite killers of all time as well. Though his crimes may be a little hard to digest, I'm sure we can all still enjoy the feast of information that I have brought forth. And my jokes may be in rather bad taste this video. I promise you that I will try to keep them at least palatable. You know the drill, my dearest ones. Pick your poison, sit back, relax, and let's have ourselves a little conversation.
Before we begin, you must all be warned. Nothing here is vegetarian. Bon appetit.
Yes, vegetarian indeed. Anyway, let us get on with our conversation. Our killer of the hour is none other than the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer. He is an American serial killer born May 21st, 1960. Unlike most serial killers who are born in November, however, Jeffrey Dahmer did die in November 28th in 1994. He was also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal and was an American serial killer and sex offender. He actually committed the crimes of rape, murder, and dismemberment of 17 men and boys between the years of 78 and 91. Many of his later murders actually involved necrophilia and cannibalism, and even the permanent preservation of body parts, typically all or part of the skeleton, though he was rather partial to preserving skulls and genitalia. Jeffrey Dahmer was a rather tall man. He was about 6 foot even, or 1.83 meters. And in fact, he was not given the death penalty. In fact, Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty in 1853, if memory serves. He was actually killed by another inmate. The murderer was murdered. Meta. Very meta. He was also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal and the Milwaukee Monster. He actually had 16 life terms consecutively for his crimes. His convictions were murder, child molestation, indecent exposure, disorderly conduct, and public intoxication. While he only was charged and convicted of 16 murders, he actually had 17 victims. As one of the victims, there was absolutely no evidence, and Jeffrey Dahmer had no memory of killing his 17th victim. The span of his killings was from June 18th and 78 to July 19th and 91. Though the only states he did in fact murder in were Wisconsin and Ohio, some of his victims indeed did come from Illinois, specifically Chicago. Though he was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he died in the Columbia Correctional Institute in Portage, Wisconsin. He was 34 years old at the time. Jeffrey Dahmer was also diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypical personality disorder, and psychotic disorder. However, he was found legally sane at his trial. Dahmer was actually sentenced to 15 terms of life imprisonment in February of 92. He was later sentenced to a 16th term of life imprisonment for the additional homicide he committed in Ohio in 1978. On November 28th of 94, Dahmer was actually beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution. Now, Dahmer does not have the typical sob story that we are accustomed to. In fact, when he was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he was the first of 2 sons born to his parents. His mother worked as a teletype machine instructor, while his father, actually, at the time, was a student at Marquette University working towards a degree in chemistry. Another interesting fact about Jeffrey Dahmer is that not only did he travel outside of his ethnic group for killers, which is not a common trait among serial killers, as they mostly do stay within their ethnic group. Not only did he do that, he also went outside of his own sexuality, as Jeffrey Dahmer is actually one of the very few LGBT serial killers. Another interesting fact about Jeffrey Dahmer is that despite everything that he did, there was very little to suggest that he was sadistic with his victims. Though one may say that his dismembering of victims, not only that, but also his cannibalism and necrophilia, I would still hesitate to call him sadistic, as when he did kill his victims, the vast majority of them, save for preferably maybe 2, though there is only evidence for 1, is that they were all unconscious when he killed them, thus preventing them from truly feeling any pain. Now, it is actually claimed that Dahmer was deprived of attention as an infant, as Dahmer's mother found the routine of breastfeeding exhausting and irritating. She refused to feed her son in that manner. Now, if you do follow Freud's psychoanalysis of the human development, in fact, you will know that the first stage in a child's life is the oral stage, or having an oral fixation at that stage, which revolves very heavily around breastfeeding. Freud also theorized that perhaps that a disturbance in this particular stage would then result in mental disorders, in which case Jeffrey Dahmer would be the poster child for this. However, other sources suggested that Dahmer was actually doted upon as an infant and as a toddler by both his parents, although his mother was known to be tense, greedy for attention, and very argumentative with her husband and their neighbors. Now, in fact, Jeffrey Dahmer was described as being an energetic and happy child until notably subdued after undergoing abdominal hernia surgery, which was performed shortly before his 4th birthday. Now, at an early age, Dahmer actually manifested an interest in animals, which is not surprising. First, it started as him collecting insects such as dragons and butterflies, which he placed inside jars, but then moved on to collecting animal carcasses from the roadside. In fact, on one occasion, he actually decapitated a dog which he found dead on the street and nailed the dog's body to a tree behind his home. He then impaled the dog's head onto a wooden stake next to a wooden cross outside the family home. He later would claim that he did this because he was curious as to how animals fit together. In fact, later in life, it would later be stated by his father that the fascination with dead animals may have begun at the age of 4, when Jeffrey actually saw his father removing animal bones from beneath the family house. And in fact, it wasn't until his more teenage years that his father would take note and grow concerned for his son's placid, lethargic attitude and solitary existence, as though he did have a few friends as a young child. Once he hit his teenage years or adolescence, that quickly faded. And in fact, his father, having thought that his son was showing an initiative towards a scientific curiosity, he actually willingly demonstrated to his son as to what would happen to chicken bones were they to be placed in a bleach solution. This knowledge regarding the cleansing and preserving of bones would be used by Dahmer not only on many animal remains, but also later his own victims. Now, by the time Dahmer hit high school, he had already began to drink heavily, which is not at all surprising, as most addicts do start at around the age of 14 and 15, which Dahmer was 14 at the time. This did concern his classmates and peers, as he drank both beer and spirits, and even smuggled alcohol into school through the lining of his jacket. However, even though he was a very largely uncommunicative and very solitary student, he was also known to be a bit of a class clown, pulling pranks and the like, which soon became known as doing a Dahmer. When he reached puberty, however, Dahmer discovered that he was a homosexual. Though he did not divulge his sexual orientation to his parents, he did engage in a brief relationship with another youth, although the pair never had intercourse. It was also around this time that he, by his own admission, he began to fantasize about issues of dominance and control over a subservient partner were prevalent in his thoughts. He also revealed that these thoughts gradually became intertwined with dissection. And on one occasion, when he was approximately 16 years old, Dahmer actually conceived a rape fantasy by rendering a particular male jogger he found attractive unconscious and then making sexual use of his unconscious body. While Dahmer did attempt to do this, the jogger whom he was targeting did not pass him on that particular path that day. Having failed, Dahmer never attempted to implement this plan again. Shortly after, Dahmer, about 3 weeks from graduation, was actually observed sitting in the school parking lot and drinking several cans of beer. When a teacher confronted him about this, Dahmer merely stated that he was experiencing a lot of problems at home, and in fact he was. Actually, his parents were on the very scourge of divorce, or even were already divorced, and Joyce, his mother, had won custody of his younger brother, David, and had vacated the family residence. His father having already moved out as well. Dahmer, now 18, was living alone at his family home, and, having turned 18 and was legally an adult, was not subject to court custodial considerations. Now, on to the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer. In fact, Jeffrey started out very young. In fact, he was only 18 when he started. On June 18th, 1978, Stephen Hicks, age 18, last seen hitchhiking to a rock concert in Chippewa Lake Park. By Dahmer's admission, he was actually drawn to Stephen while hitchhiking, and that being because the youth was bare-chested. Dahmer actually bludgeoned him to death with a dumbbell and strangled him with the same instrument, before dismembering him and then using a sledgehammer to pulverize the remains and scattering them in the woodlands behind his home. The reason being behind this, and I do even theorize that possibly the reason that Dahmer even started preserving the bodies, or at least the skeletons, and even started to cannibalize his victims, was the fact that he did not want them to leave. He took that almost as a rejection. And seeing as when you consume something, they are part of you forever, that seemed to be the logical, pathological way for our good friend Jeffrey. It wasn't until about 10 years later, in 1987, that Dahmer took his next victim on November 20th, Stephen Toomey. Actually, I do find it rather interesting that both his first and second victim were both named Stephen. Now, Stephen Toomey was 25, and he was killed in a rented room at the Ambassador Hotel, though Dahmer actually claims to have no memory of murdering Stephen, but stated that he must have battered the man to death in a drunken stupor. His body was dismembered in the basement of Dahmer's grandmother's house, as that is where he lived, after not only joining the army and being honorably discharged, but also after being sent there from his father for failing to find work. Unfortunately, Dahmer actually did discard the remains in the trash, and no remains of this particular victim, along with his first victim and several others, were never found. In 1988, January 16th, James Dockstader, age 14, met Dahmer outside of a gay bar in Wisconsin. James was lured to West Allis on the pretext of earning $50 for posing for nude pictures. Dahmer then strangled James and kept his body in the basement for a week before dismembering him and discarding his remains in the trash. Much like the two previous victims, no remains were ever found. March 24th, Richard Guerrero, age 22, was drugged and strangled by Dahmer in his bedroom at his grandmother's home. Dahmer dismembered poor Richard's corpse in the basement, dissolving the flesh in acid, and disposed of the bones in the trash. He did, however, bleach and retain the skull for several months before it became by far too brittle to handle, and before Dahmer actually disposed of the skull later on. Again, no remains of this victim were ever found. In 1989, March 25th, Anthony Sears met his end at age 24. Sears was the last victim to be drugged and strangled at Dahmer's grandmother's residence. He was also the first victim from whom Dahmer permanently retained any body parts, as Dahmer found Anthony Sears particularly attractive. He preserved the skull and genitals, and they were actually found by police in a filing cabinet at his most infamous address, 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213. This following Dahmer's arrest in 1991. In 1990, May 20th, Raymond Smith, age 32, the first victim to be killed at Dahmer's apartment. Smith was a male prostitute whom Dahmer encountered at a tavern. Dahmer gave Smith a drink laced with sleeping pills and then strangled him on his kitchen floor. His skull was actually spray painted and retained. June 14th, Edward Smith, age 27, was a known acquaintance of Dahmer and who was last seen in his company at a party. Dahmer acidified Smith's skeleton. His skull was, however, destroyed unintentionally when placed in the oven in an effort to remove moisture. No remains of his were ever found. September 2nd, Ernest Miller, age 22. Miller was a dance student whom Dahmer encountered outside of a bookstore. According to Dahmer, he was especially attracted to Miller's physique. He was killed by having his carotid artery severed before being dismembered in the bathtub. And the reason for this particular change in M.O. was actually because Dahmer only had 2 sleeping pills at his disposal at the time. Now, Dahmer actually stored his entire skeleton in the bottom of a drawer of a filing cabinet. His heart, biceps, and portions of his legs were in the freezer, for later consumption. September 24th, David Thomas, age 22, encountered Dahmer near the Grand Avenue Mall. He was lured to Dahmer's apartment for the promise of money for posing nude. Once a laced drink had rendered Thomas unconscious, Dahmer decided he wasn't his type. Nevertheless, fearing that David would be upset for being drugged, Dahmer strangled him, taking Polaroid photos of the dismemberment process. No remains, however, were ever found. In 1991, February 18th, Curtis Slaughter, age 17, approached by Dahmer as he waited at a bus stop near Marquette University. Dahmer lured the poor boy and then to his apartment, where the youth was drugged and then handcuffed before he was strangled and dismembered in the bathtub. His skull, hands, and genitalia were in fact retained. April 7th was the end of Errol Lindsay, age 19, the first victim upon whom Dahmer practiced what he later described to investigators as his drilling technique, which was a process in which Dahmer drilled holes into the victim's skull through which he injected hydrochloric acid or even boiling water into the brain. According to Dahmer, this was to preserve them and keep them alive, but to keep them in a completely submissive and almost zombie-like state. However, Lindsay awoke after this practice, and after which he was again rendered unconscious with a drink laced with sedatives. Then, the man was strangled to death, and Dahmer flayed his body and retained his skin for several weeks. His skull, however, was found with Dahmer upon his arrest. May 24th was the end of Tony Hughes, age 31. Hughes was a deaf-mute who Dahmer lured to his apartment upon the promise of posing nude for photographs. As Hughes was deaf, he and Dahmer communicated using handwritten notes. He was strangled and left on Dahmer's bedroom floor for 3 days before being dismembered, with Dahmer photographing the dismemberment process every step of the way. His skull was retained and later identified from his dental records. May 27th found the end and close call of Dahmer's actual capture, with Konyak Synthosomonophone, who was age 14 and was actually the younger brother of a boy Dahmer had assaulted in 1988. Now, Konyak was drugged and had hydrochloric acid injected into his brain before Dahmer left the youth completely unattended, as he left the apartment to purchase beer. When he returned, he found the boy naked and disorientated in the street, with 3 distressed women attempting to assist him. Police arrived, however. Dahmer persuaded both police, as they did quite shoddy and very shitty police work at the time, that he and the 14-year-old boy, who he claimed under a pseudonym and that was much older, were in fact lovers, and that the youth was simply intoxicated. The police left the poor boy in Dahmer's care, telling him to take good care of him on their way out. Unfortunately, Dahmer again injected the hydrochloric acid into his brain, and this proved fatal. His head was retained in the freezer, while his body was dismembered. June 30th, Matt Turner, age 20. On June 30th, Dahmer attended the Chicago Pride Parade. At a bus stop, he encountered the 20-year-old and persuaded him to accompany him to Milwaukee to pose for a photo shoot. Turner was drugged, strangled, and dismembered in the bathtub. His head and internal organs were put in the freezer, and his torso subsequently placed in a 57-gallon drum Dahmer had purchased on July 12th. July 5th, Jeremy Weinberger, age 23, met Dahmer at a gay bar in Chicago and agreed to accompany him to Milwaukee for the weekend. Dahmer drilled through the poor man's skull and injected boiling water into its cavity. He later recalled Weinberg's deaths to be exceptional, as he was the only victim who died with his eyes open. Weinberg's decapitated body was kept in the bathtub for a week before being fully dismembered. His torso was placed in the 57-gallon drum. July 15th, Oliver Lacey, age 24, a bodybuilding enthusiast, when Dahmer enticed him to his apartment on the promise for money for posing for photographs. Lacey was drugged and then strangled with a leather strap before being decapitated, his head and heart being placed in the refrigerator. His skeleton was retained to adorn one side of a private shrine of skulls and skeletons Dahmer was actually in the process of creating when he was arrested 1 week later. In fact, Dahmer even admitted that had the police not caught him for about 6 more months, that is exactly what they would have found, a very Game of Thrones type altar. On July 19th, Joseph Bradhoff, age 25, Dahmer's last victim. Bradhoff was a father of 3 children from Minnesota who was looking for work in Milwaukee at the time of his murder. He was left on Dahmer's bed for 2 days following his murder. On July 21st, being decapitated, his head was also placed in a refrigerator and his torso in the 57-gallon drum. However, this was not the only victims of Jeffrey Dahmer. In fact, at least 2 of his victims survived. One of which actually being following the murder of David Thomas. Though Dahmer did not kill anyone for almost 5 months, in fact, he did attempt to do so on 5 separate occasions. In October of 1990 and February of 91, he unsuccessfully attempted to lure men to his apartment. He also was known to have regularly complained of both feelings of anxiety and depression during this time. But, interestingly enough, on April 23rd, Dahmer actually lured another young man to his house. However, after giving the victim a drugged coffee, he and the victim both heard his grandmother call him, saying, "Is that you, Jeff?" Although Dahmer replied in a manner that would lead his grandmother to believe that he was alone, his grandmother did observe that Dahmer wasn't, and because of this, Dahmer opted not to kill this particular victim, who actually goes completely unnamed, and instead actually waited until the man became unconscious before taking him to the county general hospital. In fact, in May 23rd of 1989, Dahmer was actually sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in the House of Correction, with a work release permitted in order that he be able to keep his job. He was also required to register as a sex offender, as he had been both tried and convicted for trying to get a young boy to come into his house to pose for nude photographs. One rather interesting and rather funny story was 1 week after the murder of Raymond Smith, on or about the date of May 27th, Dahmer actually lured yet another young man to his apartment. On this occasion, however, Dahmer himself accidentally consumed the drink laden with sedatives, intending for it to be consumed by his guest. He awoke the following day and discovered his intended victim had actually sold several items of his clothing, $300, and a watch. Obviously, Dahmer never reported this incident to police, although on May 29th, he did divulge to his probation officer at the time that he had, in fact, been robbed. As for Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest, on July 22nd of 1991, Dahmer approached 3 men with the offer of $100 to accompany him to his apartment to pose for nude photographs, drink beer, and to simply keep him company. One out of the trio, a 32-year-old man by the name of Tracy Edwards, agreed to do so. Upon entering Dahmer's apartment, Edwards noted the foul odor and several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor. Dahmer claimed to use these for cleaning bricks. After some minor conversation, Dahmer tried to request that his guest turn his attention to view the tropical fish of which he had, whereupon Dahmer placed handcuffs on his wrist. Edwards, realizing something was wrong, and once was inside Dahmer's bedroom, noted nude male posters on the wall and that a videotape of The Exorcist III was playing. He also noted a blue 57-gallon drum barrel in the corner from which a strong odor emanated. When Dahmer brandished a knife, Edwards, thinking quickly, tried to appease Dahmer by unbuttoning his shirt and saying he would allow him to take the pictures if he would remove the handcuffs and put the knife away. At that time, Dahmer simply returned his attention towards the TV. Edwards observed Dahmer rocking back and forth and chanting to himself before looking back at him. He placed his head on Edwards' chest and even listened to his heartbeat with the knife pressed against his intended victim, informing him that he intended to eat Edwards' heart. Edward, thinking very quickly, kept telling and repeatedly told Dahmer that he was his friend and that he wasn't going to run away, in hopes to actually calm him down. Edwards had already decided that he was either going to jump from the window or run through the unlocked front door upon the next available opportunity. Luckily, Edwards managed to do so. After asking to use the bathroom and seeing a momentary lapse in concentration, Edwards actually punched Dahmer in the face, knocking him off balance, and ran out the front door. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Edwards flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers on the corner of North 25th Street and explained the situation. The officers actually, though they did try to unlock the handcuffs around Edwards' wrists, they failed to do so as the key did not fit that particular model of handcuff. Edwards then went back with the officers whom he had spent the 5 previous hours with before escaping, and both officers and Edwards arrived at the apartment 213 with Dahmer inside. In fact, Dahmer invited the trio inside and acknowledged the fact that he had indeed placed the handcuffs upon Edwards, although he offered no explanation as to why. At this point, Edwards told the officers about the large knife that had been used to threaten him, and that it had happened in the bedroom. Now, while Dahmer did try to precede the officer into his bedroom to get the keys, he was told by one of the officers to back off. At this point, one of the officers noted that there was in fact a large knife beneath the bed, and also saw an open drawer. Upon closer inspection, he realized that it contained Polaroid pictures, many of which were human bodies in various stages of dismemberment, and upon looking around, he actually realized that these pictures were taken in the very apartment in which they were standing, showing his partner and uttering the words, "These are for real." The officers quickly arrested Dahmer, and though Dahmer did fight, he was actually quite quickly restrained. Calling upon a second squad car for backup, Mueller, one of the officers, actually opened the refrigerator to reveal a freshly severed head of a black male on the bottom shelf, allegedly crying out, "There's a damn head in the fridge!" Upon this, and upon turning his head towards the officer, Dahmer admittedly muttered the words, "For what I did, I should be dead." On a more detailed search of the apartment conducted by the Criminal Investigation Bureau revealed a total of 4 severed heads, 7 skulls, some bleached and some painted, blood drippings at the tray of the bottom of Dahmer's refrigerator, 2 human hearts, portion of arm muscle, each wrapped in plastic bags upon the shelves. It was also discovered an entire human torso, bags of human organs, flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom, 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, a mummified scalp in a 57-gallon drum, 3 more torsos were dissolving in acid solution, and a total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing dismemberment of Dahmer's victims were also found, and a partridge in a motherfucking pear tree. Upon all of this and the discovery and recoveries of the body parts and artifacts in the 924 North 25th Street apartment, Chief Medical Examiner later stated it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. Dahmer was actually questioned by 2 detectives Patrick Kennedy and Detective Patrick Murphy, over the following 2 weeks, and thus totaling a combined 60 hours of interviews and interrogation. Dahmer not only waived his rights to a lawyer during this time, but also during his own trial. After being convicted, Dahmer was actually sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, for his first year of incarceration. He was actually placed in solitary confinement during this time due to his concerns for physical safety should he come into contact with fellow inmates. After that, he was then transferred to a less secure unit where he was assigned a 2-hour daily work detail cleaning the toilet block of both staff and prison inmates. Shortly after, completing his lengthy confessions in 91, Dahmer had requested to Detective Murphy that he be given a copy of the Bible. This request was granted, and Dahmer actually devoted himself to becoming a born-again Christian. However, this would not end well. In fact, in July of 94, fellow inmate Oswald Dorothy attempted to slash Dahmer's throat with a razor blade embedded in a toothbrush as Dahmer returned to his cell from the weekly church service conducted in the prison chapel. Dahmer, however, received superficial wounds and was not seriously hurt in this incident. According to Dahmer's family, he had long been ready to die and accept any punishment that he may endure in prison. And in fact, he would often respond to their comments to the effect of, when being asked of his physical well-being, "It doesn't matter. I don't care if something happens to me." Death would soon come, as on the morning of November 28th in 94, Dahmer left his cell to conduct his assigned work detail, accompanied by 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. The trio left unsupervised in the showers of the prison and were gone for approximately 20 minutes. At about 8:10 a.m., Dahmer was discovered on the floor of the bathrooms of the gym suffering from extreme head and facial wounds. He had been bludgeoned about the head and face with a 20-inch or 51-centimeter metal bar. His head had been repeatedly struck against the wall during the assault as well. Anderson had also been beaten with the same instrument, and while Dahmer had been alive and rushed to a nearby hospital, he was pronounced dead 1 hour later, while Anderson died 2 days later from his wounds. Scarver, who was serving a life sentence for a murder committed in 1990, informed authorities he had first attacked Dahmer with the metal bar as he had been cleaning the staff locker room before attacking Anderson, who was cleaning the inmate locker room. According to Scarver, Dahmer did not yell or make any noise as he was attacked. In fact, many believed Scarver was suffering from schizophrenia, as when he returned to his cell, he informed a prison guard, "God told me to do it. Jesse Anderson and Jeffrey Dahmer are dead." Scarver was adamant he had not planned the attacks in advance, though he did later divulge to investigators that he had concealed the iron bar used to kill both men in his clothing shortly beforehand. Upon learning of his death, Dahmer's mother, Joyce, responded angrily to the media. "Now is everybody happy? Now that he's bludgeoned to death? Is that good enough for everyone?" While the response of the families of Dahmer's victims were mixed, it was appearing that most were pleased of his death. However, the district attorney who prosecuted Dahmer cautioned against turning Scarver into a folk hero, noting that Dahmer's death was still a murder. Scarver was sentenced to 2 additional life terms for the murders of Dahmer and Anderson a little while later in 1995. Dahmer, after his death, had actually stated in his will that he wished for no services to be conducted and that he wished to be cremated. And in September of 95, that is exactly what was done. Dahmer's body was cremated and his ashes divided between his parents. Now, for Dahmer's estate, which was awarded to the families of 11 of his victims who had sued for damages, it was actually done and created, sparking actually controversy, as they had planned to auction off Dahmer's estate and all of his belongings. However, a civic group, Milwaukee Civic Pride, actually was quickly established in an effort to raise the funds to purchase and destroy his possessions. The group was successful in doing this, and Dahmer's possessions were subsequently destroyed and buried in an undisclosed Illinois landfill. And in fact, the last resident of Dahmer's old apartment, in fact the entire apartment complex, has actually been destroyed and has not yet been rebuilt or even had a memorial set up in its place. Though there has been talk of doing so, nothing has actually been done there. And that is all the time I have for you today, my loveliest horde. I do hope that the series of videos I do intend to be uploading today and tomorrow will make up for my absence for the past 3 weeks. And as always, my dearest ones, blessed be and stay classy.